My name is Marin Whitaker, and I am 38 years old. For most of my life, I had been the daughter who understood, the daughter who adjusted, the daughter who made things easier for everyone else. That was why, when my father stood up at my younger sister's engagement dinner with a champagne glass in one hand and a cream-colored envelope in the other, no one in that room looked at me first. They looked at Brielle. She was glowing under the warm lights of the restaurant, her diamond catching every flicker from the candles. Camden had one hand on the back of her chair, already smiling like he knew what was coming. My mother sat beside them with both hands folded beneath her chin, wearing the soft, proud expression she usually saved for church announcements and Brielle's Instagram milestones. My father cleared his throat. "Your mother and I wanted to give you both something real to begin your marriage with," he said. The room went quiet in that happy, expectant way people do when they are about to witness generosity. Then he handed Brielle the envelope. She opened it slowly. Her mouth fell open. Camden leaned over her shoulder, read the first page, and whispered, "No way." My father smiled wider. "The Hawthorne apartment," he said. "It's yours." Everyone clapped. I remember the sound more than anything. Glasses ringing, chairs shifting, someone saying, "What an incredible gift." My aunt pressing a napkin to her eyes. My mother reaching across the table to squeeze Brielle's hand. And me, sitting there, with my fork still beside my untouched salmon, trying to understand how the apartment I had lived in for 7 years, repaired with my own money, and saved from foreclosure with nearly everything I had just become my sister's engagement present. After dinner, my mother followed me into the hallway. Her voice was gentle. "Marin, don't make this difficult. You have 2 days to move out. Before the story begins, please subscribe to support the channel. Is something weighing heavily on your heart today? If so, type 1. If you are still at peace today, type 2. Whatever your state of mind, I hope this story will be like a warm cup of tea, helping to soothe your heart a little. And now, let's begin. For a moment, I thought my mother had said it wrong. 2 days sounded too small for a life. Too small for 7 years of rent checks, weekend repairs, late-night hardware store runs, and the kind of hope I had been embarrassed to admit I still carried. But she just stood there in the hallway, outside the private dining room, smoothing the front of her dress, like she had delivered an uncomfortable but reasonable instruction. "Brielle needs stability," she said. "You've always been the one who can manage." That was the sentence they used whenever they wanted me to bleed quietly. I was practical. I was steady. I was mature. Brielle was delicate, bright, easily overwhelmed, always needing someone to make the path softer before she walked on it. I looked past my mother's shoulder at the door to the dining room. Behind it, people were laughing again. My sister was probably showing the papers to Camden's mother. My father was probably accepting praise for his generosity. I nodded once, because arguing in that hallway would have given her exactly what she wanted. Proof that I was difficult. I left through the side entrance and drove back to Hawthorne in the rain. The apartment was dark when I opened the door, except for the little stove light I always left on over the kitchen. I stood there for a long time, looking at the place they had just given away. Not the furniture, not the walls, the evidence, the outlet covers I had replaced, the windows I had paid to seal before winter. The kitchen floor Deacon Mills had installed after the old boards swelled from a leak no one but me had cared enough to fix. Then, I stopped looking at it like a home. I looked at it like a claim. I made coffee. I did not drink, pulled the plastic storage bin from my bedroom closet, and emptied 7 years onto the kitchen table. Bank transfers, contractor invoices, permit copies, inspection photos, HOA statements. The email my mother had written after I paid the arrears, promising that every major payment would be credited toward future ownership. A text from my father, saying, 7 years, and it's yours. At 1:17 a.m., I sent the packet to Meredith Sloan. By morning, my phone was lighting up with my father's name. The first voicemail was controlled, the second was not. "Marin, what did you send to the title company?" When Meredith called at 8:42, her voice was calm. "The transfer has been placed under review," she said, and Camden's lender wants clarification before they touch that apartment. I stood at the kitchen window and watched rain slide down the glass. They had given me 2 days to disappear. They forgot I worked in claims. I knew how to document damage before it spread. To understand why I kept every receipt, you have to understand the house I was raised in. Fairness was never a rule there. It was something I watched from the outside, like people walking past a warm restaurant window while I stood on the sidewalk pretending I was not hungry. Brielle was 9 years younger than me, and my parents treated her needs like weather, unavoidable, urgent, something the whole family had to adjust around. If she changed her mind, she was sensitive. If I changed mine, I was unreliable. When she wanted a professional camera at 17, my father called it supporting her vision. When my car needed tires at 26, he told me emergencies were what savings accounts were for. By 27, I had learned to make my life small enough not to inconvenience anyone. I was working as a claims adjuster then, spending my days walking through other people's disasters: smoke, stained kitchens, flooded basements, ceilings opened by storms, families standing in socks on ruined floors while trying not to fall apart in front of a stranger with a clipboard. I understood damage. I understood what it cost to repair something after years of neglect. What I did not understand yet was how much of my own life had been handled the same way. At Sunday dinner, my mother mentioned the apartment as if she were offering rescue. "Your grandmother's place in Hawthorne is sitting empty," she said. "You could move in. We'd only charge you 75% of market rent." My father nodded, pleased with himself. "It would help us cover expenses, and it would give you a proper place." Across the table, Brielle was showing Camden mood boards for a styled bridal shoot my parents had agreed to fund. She barely looked up. I remember feeling grateful before I felt embarrassed. That was how well I had been trained. If love came with conditions, I still called it love. The first time my father opened the apartment door, he stayed in the hallway. The smell came out first. Stale water, dust, old heat trapped in closed rooms. The radiator clicked like it was arguing with itself. Cabinet drawers stuck halfway. One closet door leaned off its track. In the bathroom, the mirror had black spots blooming beneath the glass. My father gave a little shrug and said, "It needs work." I stepped inside anyway. The place was tired, but it was quiet. No one was praising Brielle. No one was measuring me against her. For the first time in years, I stood in a room my family had forgotten, and instead of feeling unwanted, I felt possibility. I moved in on a Friday with 2 suitcases, a folding mattress, and a box of kitchen things I had collected from clearance aisles over the years. The apartment did not feel like home yet. It felt like a place that had been left waiting too long. Still, there was something almost merciful about its quiet. No one was praising Brielle in the next room. No one was comparing my life to hers. No one was asking me to be grateful for less. At night, the pipes knocked behind the wall. The bathroom faucet shrieked before the water warmed. The bedroom window needed both hands and one shoulder to close. I learned those things the way lonely people learn a new apartment, not all at once, but through repetition. After work, I came home in my blazer and flats, changed into old jeans, and started again. I cleaned until my shoulders ached. I scraped paint from the trim with a dull putty knife. I watched videos about patching plaster and borrowed a ladder from Hazel across the hall, who handed it over with a warning to respect gravity and cheap ceilings. Hazel Grant was 70, sharp-eyed, and retired from a law office, though she still spoke like every sentence had been reviewed for accuracy. On Saturday mornings, she brought coffee in a chipped blue mug and stood in the doorway while I worked. Once, after I had spent 3 hours sealing a draft around the living room window, she looked around and said, "You're bringing this place back." I laughed. "I'm just trying to make it livable." "Sometimes," she said, "that's the same thing." Month by month, the apartment changed. Not dramatically. Not like television, where a ruined room becomes beautiful before the next commercial break. It changed in small, stubborn ways. A working light over the sink. Shelves that held books without leaning. Curtains that made the evenings feel private instead of abandoned. A kitchen corner where I could drink coffee before work and feel, for 10 quiet minutes, like my life belonged only to me. When something was beyond my hands, I hired Deacon Mills, a contractor with a calm voice and a habit of explaining problems without making me feel stupid. He showed me old wiring, soft spots near the bathroom wall, and places where neglect had turned expensive. I paid him in installments and ate cereal for dinner some weeks. I told myself it was worth it, because every repair made the apartment feel less like a favor, and more like proof that I could build something no one had bothered to give me. For the first few years, my parents barely noticed what I was doing to the apartment. They came by only when they needed a form signed, a package picked up, or a favor delivered in the careful language of family. My father would stand just inside the door, glance around, and say, "Looks better," with the same tone he used when someone washed his car. My mother sometimes brought old pantry items from her kitchen and called them perfectly good, as if I should be grateful for dented cans and rice close to expiration. At first, their indifference hurt. Then, it became useful. It gave me room to make the place mine without their opinions hanging over every choice. By the 6th year, that changed. The apartment no longer looked forgotten. The kitchen had warm counters and quiet hinges. The living room caught afternoon light in a way that made even gray Portland days feel gentle. The hallway no longer smelled like dust and old water. My mother noticed first. She ran her fingers across the butcher block counter and smiled too slowly. "This looks professional," she said. My father opened the cabinets, checked the windows, and gave a low whistle. "Units around here are going for more than I expected." I thought he was making conversation. I should have known better. After that, their visits became inspections. My father walked from room to room as if measuring square footage in his head. My mother asked where I kept my receipts, then smiled when I looked at her too sharply. "For taxes," she said. "You're always so organized with paperwork." One rainy Sunday afternoon, she stood in the living room, looking at the walls I had painted, the shelves I had installed, the floor I had saved for months to replace. "When you're finished," she said, "this place could really help the whole family. Not when you're settled. Not when you're happy." Finished. As if I were a crew they had forgotten to pay. The first real warning came from Hazel. I found her in the hallway, with her mail tucked under one arm, staring toward the stairwell. "Your father brought a man through here yesterday," she said. "Suit, clipboard, realtor shoes." My stomach tightened. "Did he say why?" Hazel looked over her glasses. "Men with clipboards don't come to admire crown molding." The second warning arrived 2 months before Brielle's engagement party. Camden accidentally replied to a family email thread I was still on. One sentence sat there, plain and ugly. "If the Hawthorne unit transfers before the wedding, I can use it as collateral." I read it 3 times, then I printed it. Because my parents had not been watching me build a home. They had been waiting for the value to rise. Camden's email did not shock me as much as it should have, because it was not the first time the apartment had been turned into a family crisis when my parents needed something from me. 3 years before Brielle's engagement party, on a Thursday evening in March, my father called and asked if he and my mother could stop by after dinner. His voice was careful, almost kind, the way people sound when they already know the answer they want but still need you to feel included. They arrived without taking off their coats. My mother sat on the edge of my couch, with her purse held tightly on her lap. My father stayed near the kitchen, staring down at the floor I had not replaced yet, as if the old wood had personally disappointed him. "We're behind on the apartment expenses," he said. My mother opened a folder and slid the papers across my coffee table. HOA arrears. A special assessment fee. Property tax penalties. Late charges that had been growing quietly while I was working late, patching walls, and paying rent on time. The total was $41,800. I stared at the number until it stopped looking like money and started looking like a verdict. "If we don't clear it," my father said, "the association could place a lien on the unit." My mother leaned forward. "We would never ask if it wasn't serious." That was not true. They had asked me for things my whole life. Time, silence, flexibility, forgiveness before anyone apologized. But this was the first time the request had a comma in the middle, and my savings account sitting behind it. I don't have that kind of money just lying around, I said. You have savings, my father answered too quickly. The room went still. That was when I understood they had not come to ask whether I could help. They had come because they already knew I could. My mother reached for my hand. Marin, this place will be yours someday. We all know that. If you help protect it now, then of course that money should count toward your future ownership. I looked at her hand on mine, soft and warm and practiced. Put that in writing, I said. Both of them looked surprised. Then my mother smiled, almost proud of me for being practical. She had worked in banking for 25 years. She knew how to make language sound harmless while still meaning something. That night, she sent the email herself. Any major payment Marin makes toward the property will be credited toward future ownership transfer. I read it 6 times before I wired the money. My hand shook when I clicked confirm. Not because I was afraid of losing my savings, but because some foolish part of me believed I had finally bought a place in my own family. Before listening to today's story, don't forget to subscribe to give the channel more motivation. I don't know where you're watching this video, but I guess you've had a tough day. If you're feeling down, type 4. If you're feeling okay, type 3. I hope this story will be with you like a quiet friend in the night. Now, let's dive into the story. After I wired the money, something in me changed, though not in the way people imagine change happens. I did not become bold overnight. I did not cut them off or demand a meeting or make speeches about what I deserved. I still showed up for birthdays. I still answered my mother's calls. I still brought pie to Thanksgiving and let my father comment on the traffic as if nothing permanent had shifted between us. But I started keeping things differently. Not just receipts in a drawer. Not just emails in a folder. I built a record. At first, I told myself it was for taxes, for budgeting, for the kind of personal organization people praised when they did not want to call it fear. But deep down, I knew. I had spent my career walking through damaged homes after people swore they never thought the pipe would burst, the outlet would spark, the roof would fail. I had learned that disaster rarely arrived without warning. Most of the time, it whispered first. With my family, the whispers got louder during the year Betrayal turned 29. My mother began asking odd questions. Had I thought about putting things in storage? Did I really need so many bookshelves? Wouldn't the apartment look brighter with less furniture? She said it lightly, like advice from a woman who watched too many homestaging shows. Then my father asked for a spare key because maintenance might need access. Maintenance had my number. The building superintendent had my number. No one needed Nolan Whitaker standing in my kitchen when I was not there. I said I would think about it. Camden started appearing in conversations where he did not belong. He asked whether the building allowed short-term rentals. He asked if the unit had dedicated parking. Once, at a barbecue, he said, Hawthorne is appreciating like crazy, and watched my face over the rim of his beer. That night, I went home and opened the plastic bin again. I added everything. The $41,800 transfer confirmation, the email from my mother, my father's old text, saying, 7 years, and it's yours. Deacon's invoices, permit copies, before and after photos. Hazel's handwritten note about the man with the clipboard, even screenshots of Camden's questions, because people like him always sounded casual until money was involved. I did not know exactly what they were planning yet, but I knew enough to stop trusting the quiet. 2 weeks before the engagement party, I called Meredith Sloan for the first time. I expected her to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, she listened, asked for the documents, and said, Marin, you may not own the apartment on paper, but paper is not the only thing courts look at. I sat very still. For the first time, my silence had a witness. I did not know, when I hung up with Meredith, that I would need her so soon. I thought I was building protection for some future argument, some uncomfortable family meeting months away, where my parents would finally admit what they had promised and what I had paid. I still believed there would be a conversation before there was a betrayal. That was the last generous assumption I ever made about them. 2 weeks later, my father handed Brielle the apartment at her engagement dinner, and my mother gave me 2 days to leave. By the time I got home that night, the first text was already waiting. Please don't make this harder than it has to be. It came from my mother, of course. She had always preferred guilt in writing and cruelty in a soft voice. Before I could answer, another message appeared. We need the keys, garage remote, and mailbox key by Sunday at 5. Please leave all fixtures and built-ins. All fixtures and built-ins. I stood in my kitchen and read that phrase while looking at the pendant lights I had bought on clearance, the shelves I had installed after work, the faucet I had paid Deacon to replace when the old one leaked into the cabinet below. They were not asking me to move. They were asking me to disappear neatly, without leaving fingerprints on anything I had improved. My father called next. I let it go to voicemail. "Marin," he said, voice tight but still trying to sound reasonable. "Your mother is upset. Brielle is overwhelmed. We have been generous with you for years, and I need you to be mature about this. Don't turn your sister's engagement into some legal situation." Some legal situation. That was what people called paperwork when they were afraid it might tell the truth. Then Camden texted me directly. "Let's be adults here. You had your time in the unit. Brielle and I are trying to start our life." I stared at his message for a long moment. Not because it hurt, because it clarified things. He did not see me as family. He did not even see me as an obstacle with feelings. I was a tenant whose usefulness had expired. Near midnight, Brielle finally called. I almost answered. Then I saw Meredith's email come in with 3 words in the subject line. "Do not engage." So I didn't. Instead, I took screenshots of every message, saved every voicemail, and added each one to the folder. They thought 2 days was enough time to push me out. They did not understand that 2 days was also enough time to build a case. By Saturday evening, the apartment was half-packed and strangely peaceful. Not empty, not yet, but lighter in a way that made every sound sharper. The scrape of packing tape, the soft thud of books going into boxes, the rain tapping the windows like it had been there for every version of me that ever lived in that place. Soren came after work with his pickup and a stack of moving blankets. He did not ask questions at first. That was one of the things I trusted about him. He simply looked around, took off his jacket, and said, "Tell me what goes." "Only what's mine," I said. He nodded once. "Then we'll be careful." That mattered. I was angry, but I was not reckless. I would not give my parents the satisfaction of calling me destructive. I would not tear out cabinets or damage walls, or rip anything apart just to make pain visible. They had spent years pretending my labor did not count. I was not going to help them pretend my integrity did not count either. So I made 2 lists, one for what stayed, one for what left. The couch I bought after my first raise came with me. The dining table I sanded and stained on Hazel's balcony came with me. My curtains, my lamps, my camera at the front door, the freestanding shelves, the water filter, the rolling kitchen island, the rugs that covered the cold places in winter, all of it came with me. The built-ins stayed, the walls stayed, the floors stayed. Every repair that could not be removed without damage stayed, because Meredith had already told me the claim was stronger if I behaved like the only adult in the room. Hazel appeared in the doorway around 8 with a thermos of coffee and red eyes she pretended were from allergies. "I hate this," she said. "So do I." She looked past me into the apartment. "You know, a place remembers who loved it." I smiled because answering would have broken something open. By 10:30, the last box was in Soren's truck. The apartment echoed differently without my things, but it was not ruined. It was simply exposed. Without the warmth I had brought into it, the place looked exactly like what it was. A property my parents owned, not a home they had built. I wiped the counters, swept the kitchen, and placed a sealed envelope beside the stove. Inside were the keys, the garage remote, and a note. "I have moved out as requested. Further communication should go through my attorney. Then I turned off the lights and locked the door behind me. For the first time in 7 years, I left Hawthorne without looking back. Monday morning did not feel like a beginning. It felt like the part of a storm where the rain stops just long enough for people to step outside and see what has been damaged. I had spent Sunday night at Soren's carriage house, on a borrowed mattress under a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. I slept in pieces, waking every hour to check my phone, not because I wanted messages from my family, but because silence from them had never meant peace. At 9:10, Meredith picked me up outside a coffee shop downtown. She wore a charcoal coat, carried a leather folder, and looked entirely too calm for a woman about to walk into a family disaster with me. "Remember," she said as I got into her car, "you do not explain. You do not apologize. You answer only what I ask you to answer." I nodded. The title office sat on the 3rd floor of a glass building near the river, the kind of place with polished floors and plants that looked professionally watered. My parents were already there when we arrived. My father stood by the reception desk in a navy blazer, checking his watch like punctuality made him innocent. My mother sat stiffly in a chair, purse in her lap, lips pressed into a thin line. Brielle was beside Camden. Her engagement ring flashed every time she touched her hair. She looked tired, confused, and angry in the way people look when they have been told they are the victim but have not seen the evidence yet. Camden looked annoyed, not nervous, annoyed, as if my existence had delayed a meeting. My father saw me first. "What is she doing here?" he asked Meredith. "Not me." Meredith smiled without warmth. "Miss Whitaker has a financial interest in the property being discussed today." "My daughter has been a tenant," he said. "Nothing more." The receptionist looked down at her computer. Camden shifted in his chair. Brielle stared at me, waiting for me to deny it, to soften it, to become the older sister who made things easier. I did not. We were taken into a conference room with a long table and a speakerphone in the middle. A title officer named Mr. Bellamy introduced himself, then glanced at the folder Meredith placed in front of him. "This should be quick," Camden said. Meredith opened her folder. "It will not be quick," she said. "Before any transfer, pledge, or collateral use of the Hawthorne unit proceeds, my client is formally asserting a reimbursement and equitable interest claim based on documented payments, written representations, and improvements made in reliance on those representations." My mother's face went pale. My father leaned forward. "This is ridiculous." Meredith slid the first document across the table. "No," she said. "This is paperwork." Meredith did not raise her voice. That was what made it worse for them. She moved through the documents, the way a surgeon moves through an incision. Clean, careful, impossible to interrupt without looking foolish. First came the email my mother had sent after I paid the $41,800, the one promising that major payments would be credited toward future ownership, then the wire confirmation. Then the HOA statement showing the arrears had been cleared from my account, not theirs. My father's jaw tightened. "That was family help," he said, "not an ownership agreement." Meredith looked at him. "Then why did your wife use the words future ownership transfer?" My mother stared down at the table. Next came Deacon's invoices, electrical work, plumbing repairs, window sealing, kitchen improvements. Each page had my name, my card number, my signature. Meredith placed the before and after photos beside them. The apartment with stained walls and warped cabinets. The same rooms years later, clean and bright and valuable. Brielle leaned forward slowly. "You paid for all of that?" she asked me. I wanted to say, "You never asked." I wanted to say, "You were too busy receiving things to wonder where they came from." Instead, I said, "Yes." Camden exhaled hard. "Improvements don't make her the owner." "No," Meredith said. "But improvements made in reliance on written promises can create a claim, and that claim has been formally noticed." Mr. Bellamy, the title officer, adjusted his glasses and looked at his screen. "At this point, we cannot proceed with a clean transfer or collateral pledge until this dispute is resolved." The room went still. That was the first time I saw Camden look afraid. Not sad, not ashamed, afraid. "My lender is expecting this today," he said. Mr. Bellamy folded his hands. "Then your lender will need clarification." Brielle turned to him. "Why does your lender need my apartment?" No one answered fast enough. Camden's face changed before his words did. "It was just leverage. Temporary. For the venue project." "The wedding venue?" Brielle asked. "Our future," he snapped. That one word did what all my documents had not. It made Brielle flinch. My mother reached for her hand, but Brielle pulled away. "You told me this was a gift," she whispered. "It is," my father said quickly. "Your sister is just making it difficult." For the first time, I looked directly at him. "No," I said. "You made it expensive. I made it documented." Meredith slid the final notice across the table. The transfer was frozen. The loan was delayed. And the story my parents had wrapped in generosity had finally been opened under fluorescent office lights, where everyone could see what was inside. The first thing to collapse was not the apartment transfer, it was the wedding plan built on top of it. Camden tried to recover in the hallway after the meeting, pacing with his phone pressed to his ear, using words like timing, underwriting, and temporary setback. Brielle stood 10 feet away from him, arms crossed, staring at the floor as if she had just noticed the shape of the trap she had been standing inside. For once, no one asked me to comfort her. By the end of that week, Eloise Price had withdrawn the money she and her husband had promised for the wedding venue. I heard that from Hazel, who heard it from the building superintendent, who heard everything whether he wanted to or not. Eloise had apparently told Camden she would not put family money into a marriage that began with disputed property and a lie. I never met her after that, but I respected the sentence. Brielle postponed the wedding 2 days later. My parents blamed me, of course. My mother left one voicemail saying I had humiliated them in public. My father sent a text that said, "You could have handled this privately." I almost laughed when I read it. Privately was where they had always wanted my pain to stay. Meredith handled the rest. There were letters, appraisals, calls between attorneys, and one very quiet mediation where my father stared at the conference table and my mother cried without looking at me. The apartment was eventually sold, not to Brielle, not to Camden, not to anyone my parents could control. From the proceeds, I received the $89,000 I had documented, plus interest and legal fees. It did not repay the years. Money cannot give back the younger version of you who kept waiting to be chosen, but it paid for something almost as important: a clean start. 6 months later, I bought a small townhouse in Beaverton, with blue shutters, uneven rose bushes, and a kitchen window that caught morning light. The deed had only one name on it: mine. When I unlocked the door for the first time, I did not cry. I just stood there with my hand on the knob, listening to the quiet, and realized no one could turn that quiet against me. Hazel mailed me a rosemary plant with a card tucked into the soil. "For a home no one can give away." I keep that card in my desk. I do not go to family dinners anymore. I do not lend money. I do not explain boundaries to people who only understand access. If my parents call, I let the phone ring until I know whether I actually want to answer. For years, I thought a home was a place someone finally allowed me to stay. Now I know better. A home is where your name belongs before anyone else's permission. What Marin's story teaches us is not just about property, money, or paperwork. It is about the quiet cost of being the person everyone assumes will always understand. Sometimes, families do not hurt us with shouting. Sometimes, they hurt us with expectations. They ask for patience, then call it maturity. They take our labor, then call it love. They depend on our silence, then act surprised when that silence finally becomes a boundary. Marin spent years trying to earn a place in her own family. She believed that if she worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, stayed calm enough, and gave enough, someone would finally look at her and say, "You matter too." But the painful truth is this: love that must be purchased with your peace is not love. It is a debt that never stops collecting. The most powerful part of her story is not that she got her money back, it is that she stopped begging to be chosen by people who only valued her when she was useful. She learned that resilience is not always loud. Sometimes, resilience is keeping records. Sometimes it is walking out quietly. Sometimes it is buying a small house with your own name on the deed and realizing you no longer need permission to belong. Family should be a place of safety, not a system where one person is always asked to disappear so someone else can shine. And if you have ever been that person, the one who gave too much, forgave too fast, and waited too long to be seen, let this story remind you, your life is not a spare room in someone else's house. It belongs to you. What would you have done in Marin's place? Would you have fought for the apartment, walked away, or exposed everything sooner? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and join us for more stories about strength, family, betrayal, and finding the courage to choose yourself.